Well, they finally did it. It looks like the U.S. military has taken out Qassem Soleimani. They've been talking about this for years. Just as I guess for folks outside the U.S. who are listening to this, to give an idea of how important Qassem Soleimani is to the narrative in American media about Iran. He is the only Iranian person, other than the current Ayatollah, the original Ayatollah from 1979, and the current president of Iran, who Americans would actually be familiar with and might recognize his name, because he comes up a lot. He's talked about constantly as this architect of all these terrorist attacks and how he's killed thousands and thousands of Americans. We've heard this for years. This is a part of the propaganda of going back to the Iraq War, in which Iran was blamed for the deaths of I can't remember how many it was, about I think maybe 2,000 U.S. soldiers they tried to tie back to Soleimani. And actually the way that they did that was that any time that a U.S. soldier was killed in combat with someone who happened to be a Shiite, whether they were affiliated with Iran in any way or not, it was assumed that they were on orders from Soleimani. But now I guess they can't use him as a scapegoat anymore, because he's dead. They blew him up at the Baghdad airport. Apparently he was coming from Beirut, and he was traveling with quite a few people. They had quite the entourage. I guess his son-in-law was there. Apparently the deputy leader of Hezbollah in Lebanon was there, although I don't know if that's confirmed yet. And his host in the country was the head of the popular mobilization units, a guy I've been talking about quite a bit this week. What's his name? Mohandas. Mohandas, of course, was the former leader of Kataib Hezbollah, who the U.S. targeted earlier in those airstrikes that killed 25 of their men. And as the head of the PMU, he vowed to avenge those fallen Hezbollah members, and apparently, was part in organizing that big riot outside of the embassy in Baghdad over the last, well, I guess kind of day and a half, because they did sort of have a second day of protest, but it wasn't as violent, and they weren't shooting fireworks at people. I think that was on New Year's Day that they were shooting the fireworks and set the reception area on fire. Now this, of course, is a very dangerous move. It is an act of war that the U.S. has now committed against both Iraq and Iran, because they killed both a top Iranian general and a top Iraqi general. And I'm hearing from a lot of folks online that, well, this isn't that big of a deal, because there's a lot of people in Iraq and Iran who didn't like Mohandas or Soleimani either, so they're happy to see them go. And my response to that is, well, there's a lot of people in America who say aren't fans of Mike Pompeo, our Secretary of State, who might want to see him go and no longer do things that, in our opinion, hurt the interests of Americans. But if he were to be assassinated, I think that there would be a pretty universal push to avenge his death and retaliate against those who killed him. So the idea that there are people in Iraq and Iran who do not support these two guys is somehow an indication that these people will not be angry that that their government officials, their generals, were assassinated by the U.S. In the case of Mohandas, in his own country, he wasn't even in a war zone or anything. He was at the airport. Moreover, Iraq is still officially considered an ally of the United States, and then here we are assassinating again. These aren't just troops this time. This guy is a part of the Iraqi government and in a leadership position. So while I'm at it, I'll point out the sort of unique position of Soleimani within Iran. Like Mohandas, he's not a regular general. He's not a part of the regular military. As head of the Quds force, apparently, from what I understand, he works directly for the Ayatollah, and so he's not accountable to the civilian government of Iran, which is why people make the case that there's a lot of folks in Iran who don't like him necessarily, but they can't do anything about him. But I mean, he was, the Ayatollah, the supreme leader's personal lapdog. someone who would go out and essentially like his hitman. He would lead the Ayatollah's sort of personal military faction, and he would do all sorts of covert operations. He's kind of like, I guess you could think, a director of the CIA in a sense. He'd go around, behind, in a U.S. Congress, behind the backs of Congress on behalf of the president, our own supreme leader, to go help terrorists in various countries overthrow their governments and cause trouble for U.S. enemies. Soleimani did a very similar thing on behalf of the Ayatollah. He'd go around the Middle East and try and back certain terrorist groups. And of course, this is the U.S.'s big excuse for why they killed him. And they're just saying, oh, well, he was a terrorist, and we kill terrorists. It's like that excuse worked on me when I was 10 years old, and I didn't know anything about the world. But I don't think anybody's really buying that crap anymore, and I'm very happy to see that there's been such a strong pushback on Twitter, especially from, I'm happy to say, from the Trump supporters themselves, saying that, no, Trump, this is bad. You should not do that. And interestingly enough, the people who do seem to be thrilled about this are the folks who hate Trump. And so maybe the president should take note of this and realize that you're not really doing yourself any good politically, which again is why I thought he understood this, which is why I said I didn't think that Trump would, get involved in a war with Iran. I thought that would be not politically savvy of him. Of course, that's not to say that we are involved in a war with Iran yet. Sure, we've committed an act of war, but the U.S. has committed a lot of acts of war against many countries over the years that did not result in an all-out war. And the reason for this is that pretty much every government on the world, except for nuclear states, know that they cannot stand up to the might of the United States military, and so they don't actually want to get involved in a war with America, even if they are an enemy. And a lot of the the folks who I would consider to be a bit more level-headed, folks who aren't crazy neocons or anything like that, folks that don't work in the DC think tanks are but are hawkish on Iran, are relying on Iran's rational self-interest to prevent a war here, because they're being they understand that, hey, what Trump just did was very provocative and ordinary, and it is an act of war and would be considered as such, and ordinarily you should expect there to be some a war to start and for the country that you attack to defend itself. But because Iran knows that they cannot win, it's not really in their interest to defend themselves in this case. They just would want to hunker down and hope that they don't get hit anymore. So they make the argument that assassinating Soleimani really shows Iran's weakness. Of course, it's a brinksmanship strategy, and I'm not a fan of brinksmanship. It's way too dangerous for my tastes. Frankly, if some other country wanted to do it, that'd be fine, but I live in the United States, so I don't want my government doing that. Because at the end of the day, no one my age really wants to die in a war with Iran. We have nothing to lose and nothing to gain. And so I really don't appreciate it when I see my government just sort of poking their nose in another country's face and saying, hit me. Especially when you have that epic troll Pompeo coming out after this, after the U.S. assassinates a very high-ranking Iranian official and says, yeah, we seek de-escalation with Iran, and we just want them to stop their aggression already. It's like, I mean, how does this guy even sleep at night, the way he talks? He let the mask slip once, and he said, hey, in the CIA, your job is to lie, and I forget the exact line, but he said something about how they teach you to lie, and he said lie like 5 times. But he's right. That is what Pompeo does. That's what he did at the CIA, and that's what he does now at the State Department. And I mean, he gets up there, and you can see his face is just dead. He's just dead inside as he's saying this. He's like, yeah, we seek de-escalation with Iran, because look at these guys. Iran is the evil empire. It's like no one with 2 brain cells to rub together could actually think that. Unless there's someone who's so thoroughly propagandized by the media that they can't see the forest through the trees, or in this case, the empire through the fog of war. So all that's left now really to watch, now that the U.S. has, committed an act of war against Iran and Iraq, is to see what Iran's response will be. will they act in their rational self-interest, which again is to avoid war at all costs, because Iran can't win. The U.S. can't win either, but the U.S. will not be defeated. In a sense, they will not be defeated by the Iranian government. So they will be successful in toppling the regime no matter what. But of course, it's not in the U.S.'s interest to go to war either, because you'll end up in another quagmire like Afghanistan or Iraq. That is something, though, that the U.S. could survive. And in the case of the Iranian government, they could not survive a war with the United States. So will they act in their rational self-interest and try to avoid a war at all costs, even if that means being thoroughly humiliated? Or will they try their own sort of, it's not really brinksmanship if they're doing proportionally, but will they try and come up with some kind of a proportional response to try and, get the Americans to back down, to say, hey, we're serious? Are they going to continue playing this game of chicken with the United States? And by proportional response, of course, I mean assassinating some equally high-level American official, like, I don't know, a Pompeo or an Esper, some cabinet official. Now, of course, this would be much tougher for Iran to do, since Iran doesn't have any resources anywhere near the United States. So as long as anyone that they want to assassinate is in the United States, they're pretty much safe. So I don't think that the odds are too high that Iran could come up with some sort of an eye for an eye out of this situation. But I think that's the next step here if things are going to get worse. If Iran doesn't want to avenge Soleimani, I think that they'll just kind of come out with some sort of response in name only, and maybe blow up some meaningless target, just so that they can say that, oh, we responded. Kind of like Trump did back in a few months ago. He blew up something that belonged to Iran, shot a missile at them, just to say that he did something. Same thing he did with Syria when he bombed that empty airstrip. Instead, shot 120 missiles or something at it, spent, billions of dollars. Iran might do something similar and then say, oh, see, we retaliated against the U.S. So we'll just have to wait and see on that. If you get anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.